The morning of October 26, 1942, dawned with deceptive calm over the South Pacific. The USS Enterprise, known to her crew as the Big E, cut through dark waters northeast of the Santa Cruz Islands, her flight deck already alive with activity. Lieutenant Commander James Caldwell stood in the carrier's airplot room, studying the radar screen with growing unease. The green phosphorescent sweep revealed nothing yet, but intelligence reports had been clear. Japanese carrier forces were operating somewhere in these waters, hunting for American ships with the same determination the Enterprise crew felt hunting them. Caldwell was 31 years old, a veteran of Midway and the Eastern Solomons, with a quiet intensity that made younger pilots both respect and fear him slightly. His fingers drummed against the plotting table as he watched Ensign Robert Hayes, barely 22, mark positions on the tactical map with careful precision. The kid's hand shook slightly, though he tried to hide it. Outside, the tropical sun was climbing higher, burning off the morning haze. The flight deck crew worked with practiced efficiency, spotting fighters for combat air patrol, their movements choreographed by months of training and recent combat experience. The smell of aviation fuel, mixed with salt air, a scent every carrier sailor knew intimately. Somewhere below decks, machinery hummed with constant vigilance, keeping the massive ship alive and operational. If you're finding this story as compelling as we hope, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel. It helps us bring you more authentic historical narratives like this one. Commander Caldwell knew the statistics cold. The Mitsubishi A6M was faster, more maneuverable, and had a better rate of climb than the Grumman F4F Wildcats his squadron flew. Japanese pilots had more combat experience on average, having fought in China since 1937. The Zero could turn inside an American fighter in a dogfight, could climb away when threatened, could chase down and destroy bombers with devastating efficiency. American pilots had learned these lessons in blood over the past 10 months of war. But Caldwell had also learned something else. The Zero had weaknesses, no armor plating protecting the pilot, no self-sealing fuel tanks, a tendency to burn when hit with incendiary rounds. And Japanese pilots, for all their skill, often relied on individual initiative rather than coordinated tactics. These facts had become the foundation of American fighter doctrine in the Pacific, written in after-action reports and passed from squadron to squadron like sacred text. The radio crackled to life at 0800 hours. Fighter Direction Officer Lieutenant Marcus Webb's voice came through with controlled urgency. Multiple bogies bearing 020, distance 60 miles and closing. Count shows at least 40 aircraft, probably mixed fighters and dive bombers. Caldwell felt his pulse quicken, but kept his voice level as he responded. Understood. Scrambling additional cap now. Get every available fighter airborne. On the flight deck, plane handlers sprinted to their positions. The air boss's voice boomed over loudspeakers, directing the organized chaos as more Wildcats were brought up from the hangar deck on the massive elevators. Pilots ran toward their aircraft, pulling on gloves and checking harnesses as they climbed into cramped cockpits. Aviation ordnancemen made final checks on machine guns and ammunition belts. Lieutenant William Martinez, 26 years old with dark hair and steady brown eyes, was already strapped into his Wildcat when the scramble order came. He'd flown combat missions over Guadalcanal, had seen friends spiral into the ocean trailing smoke, had learned to keep his head moving constantly in combat, searching for the enemy that could appear from any angle. His hands moved through the startup checklist automatically, muscle memory taking over while his mind focused on the tactical situation. The first wave of defenders took off at 08:15, their Pratt & Whitney engines roaring as they climbed into the brilliant Pacific sky. Martinez was among them, feeling the familiar stomach-dropping sensation as his wheels left the deck and the ocean opened up below. He banked into formation with his wingman, Ensign Thomas Riley, a stocky kid from Boston, who'd been in the squadron for 3 months and showed good instincts. "Stay tight, Riley," Martinez said over the radio. "Don't try to turn with them. Slash attacks only, just like we practiced." "Roger that, sir," Riley's voice came back, trying to sound confident. The minutes ticked by with agonizing slowness as the Wildcats climbed to altitude. At 15,000 feet, the air was thinner, colder. Martinez scanned the horizon constantly, knowing the enemy could appear at any moment. Below, the Enterprise looked like a toy boat on a blue tablecloth, white wake trailing behind her as she maneuvered for maximum launch efficiency. At 0832, Martinez spotted them, dark specks against the northeastern sky, growing larger by the second. His stomach clenched. "Tally-ho, tally-ho, bandits at 2 o'clock high, angels 16. The Japanese formation was textbook perfect, 15 Zero fighters flying top cover for a larger group of Aichi dive bombers. The Zeros had their distinctive long-range tanks still attached, which meant they'd come from far away, probably from one of the Japanese carriers operating north of the Santa Cruz Islands. The dive bombers were painted in dark green camouflage with red Hinomaru circles on their wings, already beginning their descent toward the American task force. Caldwell's voice came over the radio from the Enterprise's Combat Information Center, calm and authoritative. "All fighters, this is air plot. Vector 285 to intercept. Hit the dive bombers first, then engage fighters. Use altitude advantage. Diving attacks only." Martinez pushed his throttle forward, feeling the Wildcat accelerate. This was it. Everything they'd trained for, all the tactical discussions and mock dogfights, all the analysis of combat reports from Pearl Harbor and the Coral Sea and Midway. This was the test. The American fighters dove from superior altitude, trading height for speed, building up momentum for the critical first pass. Martinez selected the rightmost dive bomber in the enemy formation, lined up his gun sight, and waited for the range to close. 1,400 yards, 1,200, 1,000. His thumb hovered over the trigger. At 800 yards, he pressed down. The Wildcat shuddered as all 6 50-caliber machine guns opened fire simultaneously, converging streams of tracers reaching out toward the enemy bomber. The Japanese aircraft staggered as rounds struck home, pieces flying off its engine cowling. Black smoke began streaming from its radial engine. Martinez pulled up hard, his vision tunneling slightly from the G-forces, and looked back in time to see the damaged bomber roll inverted and begin a death spiral toward the ocean far below. No parachute appeared. But there was no time to watch. A Zero had latched onto Riley's tail, closing fast. Martinez banked hard right, bleeding speed deliberately, trying to position himself for a deflection shot. The Zero pilot was good, staying right with Riley through a series of desperate turns, waiting for the perfect firing solution. "Brake left, Riley, brake left now." The younger pilot responded instantly, hauling his Wildcat into a violent turn. The Zero overshot slightly, and Martinez seized the opportunity. He rolled inverted, pulled the nose down, and fired a long burst from an almost 90-degree deflection angle. It was a difficult shot, requiring precise leading of the target, but his rounds walked across the Zero's fuselage. The Japanese fighter seemed to hesitate in mid-air, then exploded in a ball of orange flame. The radio was chaos now. Multiple voices overlapping with warnings, vectors, and status reports. Martinez forced himself to breathe, to think. The tactical situation was developing faster than anyone could track individually. More Wildcats were arriving from the Enterprise, climbing to join the fight. More Japanese aircraft were coming in from the north, a seemingly endless stream of them. At 0841, Lieutenant Martinez found himself in the fight of his life. 3 Zeros had apparently decided he was worth their concentrated attention, and they worked together with frightening efficiency. One would attack from the front, forcing him to maneuver, while the others positioned for killing shots from the flanks or rear. Martinez remembered Caldwell's briefings. Never try to turn with a Zero. use the Wildcat's advantages: better diving speed, more rugged construction, better high-speed handling. He pushed the stick forward, diving toward the ocean with all 3 zeros following. The airspeed indicator climbed past 300 knots. The Wildcat began to vibrate, structural members groaning under the stress, but it held together. One of the zeros attempted to follow him down, but couldn't handle the high-speed dive. Martinez saw it break off, its pilot wisely choosing discretion over a structural failure. But the other 2 stayed with him, their lighter weight and better power-to-weight ratio keeping them in the chase. At 5,000 feet, Martinez executed a hard pull-out, feeling his vision grey at the edges as blood drained from his head under the G-load. The Wildcat's robust airframe absorbed punishment that would have torn a Zero apart. One of his pursuers attempted the same maneuver and succeeded. The other tried and failed, pulling up too late. Martinez heard the splash over the radio chatter, though he couldn't see it. Now it was one-on-one. The remaining Zero pilot was extremely skilled, patient, waiting for Martinez to make a mistake. They circled each other warily, 2 predators looking for an opening. Martinez was acutely aware of his fuel state and ammunition count. This couldn't go on much longer. Then he saw it. Another Wildcat, Lieutenant Junior Grade Sarah Chen, piloting, diving in from the sun. The Zero pilot never saw her coming. Her burst was short and precise, 50 caliber rounds stitching across the Zero's unprotected fuel tanks. The Japanese fighter ignited like a torch, the pilot bailing out immediately, his parachute blossoming white against the blue sky. "Thanks, Chen," Martinez gasped, his throat dry from breathing hard. "Any time, Martinez, form on me. We've got more work to do." Back on the Enterprise, Commander Caldwell monitored the battle from Combat Information Center, a dimly lit room filled with radar scopes, plotting tables, and radio equipment. Lieutenant Webb worked beside him, coordinating the defense with remarkable composure for someone only 24 years old. They vectored fresh fighters toward threats, called damaged aircraft back to the ship, and maintained a mental picture of a battle spread across hundreds of square miles of ocean and sky. The radar scope showed the Japanese attack breaking up, individual aircraft scattered across the display, but the cost was becoming clear. 3 Wildcats had gone down, though 2 pilots had been recovered by destroyers. The Enterprise herself had taken a bomb hit on her flight deck, killing 12 men and starting a fire that damage control teams were fighting with desperate efficiency. At 08:53, just 8 minutes after the initial engagement began, the tactical situation shifted dramatically. A fresh division of 4 Wildcats, led by Lieutenant Commander Caldwell himself, who had scrambled when the attack began, intercepted a group of 6 Zeros attempting to strafe the damaged carrier. The Japanese pilots had become separated from their main formation and were low on fuel after the long flight from their own carriers. Caldwell's tactical radio discipline was perfect. "Division leader to all aircraft, Delta formation. I'll take the lead pair. 2 and 3, you have the trailer. 4, cover our 6. The Americans attacked from superior altitude and with superior coordination. Caldwell's first burst caught the lead Zero perfectly, the Japanese pilot never seeing the threat until 50 caliber rounds tore through his cockpit. The fighter cartwheeled into the ocean. His wingman got the second Zero, which burned and went down trailing thick black smoke. The remaining 4 Zeros tried to scatter, but they were trapped between the ocean below and American fighters above, critically low on fuel and far from their carriers. Over the next 5 minutes, all 4 were shot down. 2 pilots managed to bail out. 2 didn't. By 0900 hours, the battle was effectively over. The Japanese attack had been broken up short of the Enterprise, though not without cost. The carrier's damage control teams had contained the fire from the bomb hit. Wounded aircraft were returning to the ship, some barely airworthy, their pilots nursing shot-up planes toward the safety of the deck. Martinez was among the last to land, his Wildcat leaking hydraulic fluid and showing over 30 bullet holes. He touched down hard, caught the number 3 wire, and felt overwhelming relief as the arresting gear brought him to a stop. Deck crew swarmed his aircraft immediately, helping him out of the cockpit. His legs shook as his feet touched the deck. Lieutenant Chen landed 2 minutes later, her aircraft in better shape, but her face showing the strain of combat. She and Martinez exchanged nods, the kind of acknowledgement that needed no words. They'd survived. Not everyone had. In the ready room below deck, pilots gathered for the inevitable debriefing. The air was thick with cigarette smoke and nervous energy. Caldwell entered at 0930, his flight suit soaked with sweat, his face showing fatigue, but also something like satisfaction. "Gentlemen and ladies," he began, looking around at the assembled pilots, "intelligence and radar tracking indicate we just shot down 15 confirmed zeros and damaged at least 8 more. We lost 3 Wildcats, but recovered 2 pilots. The dive bomber attack was largely broken up before they could reach the task force. The Enterprise took 1 hit, but remains operational." He paused, letting that sink in. "What happened up there today was exactly what we've been training for. You used altitude advantage. You worked as teams. You didn't try to turn with them. You used diving attacks and the Wildcat's superior diving speed. You demonstrated that disciplined tactics can overcome individual aircraft performance." Ensign Riley raised his hand tentatively. "Sir, I froze up there for a second when that zero got on my tail. If Martinez hadn't—" "But he did," Caldwell interrupted gently. "That's what wingmen are for. That's why we fight as pairs and divisions, not as individuals. You did fine, Riley. You followed orders, you stayed with your section leader, and you survived your first major engagement. That's more than a lot of pilots can say." The debriefing continued for another hour, examining every engagement, learning from both successes and mistakes. This was how doctrine evolved, Caldwell knew. Not from theoretical discussions in classrooms, but from the crucible of actual combat. From analyzing what worked and what didn't, from building institutional knowledge that would be passed on to the next group of pilots. Later that afternoon, Martinez found himself on the flight deck, watching recovery operations as search planes returned from hunting for downed pilots. The Pacific stretched to the horizon in every direction, beautiful and deadly. He thought about the Japanese pilots he'd killed today, wondered if they'd had families, wondered what they'd been thinking in those final moments. Chen appeared beside him, offering a cigarette. He took it, though he rarely smoked. "You okay?" she asked. "Yeah, just thinking. About the zeros we got. About how close it was. If we hadn't had altitude advantage at the start, if they'd caught us low, it could have gone very differently." Chen nodded slowly. "That's why Caldwell is always on us about positioning. Why Webb fights to get us every bit of altitude we can manage. Why the whole tactical doctrine is built around using our strengths against their weaknesses." They stood in silence for a moment, watching the sun move lower in the western sky. The Enterprise was turning south now, heading back toward friendly waters for repairs and resupply. "You know what I realized up there?" Martinez said finally. "It's not about being a better pilot than them individually. Most of those zero pilots probably have more flight hours than we do. It's about working together, about discipline, about everybody doing their job and trusting everybody else to do theirs." "Sounds like you've been listening to Caldwell's lectures." Martinez smiled slightly. "Maybe, but I saw it work today, saw it save Riley's life, saw it save mine." That evening, in the Enterprise's wardroom, the Air Wing's senior officers gathered for their own assessment of the day's action. Captain Richard Henderson, the ship's commanding officer, listened as Caldwell presented his tactical analysis. Henderson was 48, a career naval officer who'd spent 26 years working his way up through the ranks. And he understood the significance of what had happened. "Commander," Henderson said when Caldwell finished. "What you're describing is a fundamental shift in fighter tactics. The reports from Midway suggested this approach might work, but today proves it definitively. Coordinated attacks, altitude advantage, diving slashes instead of turning dogfights. This is how we fight the Zero effectively." Caldwell nodded. "Yes, sir, and it needs to be standardized across the fleet. Every fighter squadron needs to train on these tactics. Every fighter director needs to understand how to position our aircraft for maximum advantage. It's not complicated, but it requires discipline and teamwork." Lieutenant Webb spoke up from his position at the table. "Sir, the radar vectoring made a huge difference today. We got our fighters into position with altitude advantage because we knew where the enemy was coming from and could set up the intercept properly. That's a capability the Japanese don't seem to have." "Another advantage we need to exploit," Henderson agreed. "Continue developing those procedures. I want this documented thoroughly and sent to Com Air Pack for dissemination fleet-wide." Over the next several days, as the Enterprise steamed south toward Espiritu Santo for repairs, Caldwell and his team worked on detailed tactical reports. They documented every engagement, analyzed the gun camera footage, interviewed every pilot. The picture that emerged was clear. American fighters could compete successfully with the Zero when properly employed, but success required strict adherence to tactical discipline. Martinez spent his off-duty hours writing letters home to Los Angeles, trying to explain what he'd experienced in ways that wouldn't worry his family too much. He described the Pacific Islands, the tropical weather, the camaraderie among the squadron. He didn't mention the combat, the fear, the friends who hadn't come back. Some things couldn't be put into words that would make sense to people who hadn't been there. Lieutenant Chen proved to be one of the squadron's most analytical pilots, spending hours studying tactical diagrams and proposing refinements to the standard doctrine. She'd grown up in San Francisco, had learned to fly at a civilian airport in the late 1930s, and had fought her way into naval aviation at a time when few women were accepted as combat pilots. Her perspective was valuable, Caldwell realized, precisely because she'd had to think more carefully about tactics than pilots who relied primarily on physical strength or natural aggression. "The key," she explained during one tactical discussion, "is patience. The Zero pilot wants to turn with us because that's where his aircraft shines. If we refuse to fight on his terms, if we stay disciplined and only attack when we have advantage, we can control the engagement." Ensign Riley, still processing his first combat experience, listened intently to these discussions. He joined the squadron in August, had barely finished his carrier qualifications before being thrust into combat operations. The learning curve was nearly vertical, but he was determined to master it. The memory of that Zero on his tail, the way Martinez had saved him, played over and over in his mind. He needed to be that skilled, that capable. Lives depended on it. By early November, as the Enterprise completed repairs and prepared to return to combat operations, the lessons from the October engagement had been codified into formal tactical doctrine. It was distributed throughout the Pacific Fleet's fighter squadrons, accompanied by detailed analysis and specific recommendations. The report emphasized several key points. Maintain altitude advantage whenever possible. Attack from superior position using diving speed. Never attempt sustained turning dogfights with Zeros. Work in coordinated pairs and divisions. Use radar vectoring to achieve optimal positioning before engagement. Trust wingmen and maintain formation discipline. These weren't revolutionary insights, but rather the systematic application of engineering reality and tactical logic. The F-4F Wildcat was rugged, heavily armed, and could dive fast. The A6M Zero was fragile, lightly armed, and vulnerable in high-speed situations. American pilots, who fought to their aircraft's strengths and avoided its weaknesses, could win consistently, even against more experienced opponents. On November 14th, Martinez led a combat air patrol over the waters north of Guadalcanal. The Enterprise was back in action, supporting the ongoing campaign for the Solomon Islands. Japanese forces were still contesting the area fiercely, and air combat was a daily occurrence. At 10:15 that morning, radar detected an incoming raid. Martinez and his division were vectored to intercept, climbing to 20,000 feet, while Japanese aircraft approached at 15,000. The setup was perfect, exactly as doctrine prescribed. The attack went like clockwork. Martinez's division dove through the enemy formation, each pilot selecting a target, firing short bursts, then pulling up and away before the escorting Zeros could react effectively. 3 Japanese dive bombers went down in flames in the first pass. The Zeros attempted to pursue but couldn't catch the diving Wildcats. Martinez reformed his division at altitude and prepared for a second pass. This time the Zeros were ready, but they made a critical mistake. Instead of maintaining formation, they broke up to pursue individual American fighters. Martinez's division stayed together, covering each other, working as a coordinated team. Over the next 12 minutes of combat, Martinez's division shot down 2 more dive bombers and 3 Zeros without suffering any damage themselves. It was a textbook demonstration of the new tactical doctrine, and Caldwell made sure every pilot in the squadron studied the gun camera footage afterward. "This," Caldwell told them, pointing at the footage, "this is how it's done. Notice how Martinez never breaks formation. Notice how his wingman stays with him through every maneuver. Notice how they set up each other's shots. This is the standard we're looking for." Ensign Riley had flown as Martinez's wingman on that mission, and the experience had been transformative. Following Martinez through the engagement, seeing how calmly the older pilot worked, how methodically he executed each attack, had shown Riley what professional fighter combat looked like. It wasn't about heroics or individual glory. It was about precision, discipline, and teamwork. Lieutenant Chen had led the second element in that engagement, and her performance had been equally impressive. She demonstrated the same patient, methodical approach, waiting for the perfect shot rather than forcing the action. Her 2 confirmed kills brought her personal total to 6, making her one of the squadron's leading aces. By December 1942, the tactical revolution that had begun with that 8-minute engagement in October had spread throughout the Pacific Fleet. Fighter squadrons from Pearl Harbor to Australia were adopting the coordinated attack doctrine, training rigorously on altitude advantage tactics and learning to exploit their aircraft's strengths while avoiding their weaknesses. The results were measurable. American fighter squadrons were achieving increasingly favorable kill ratios against Japanese aircraft. The mystique of the Zero as an invincible fighter was fading, replaced by realistic assessment of its capabilities and vulnerabilities. American pilots were gaining confidence, not through bravado, but through proven tactical methods that worked consistently. Commander Caldwell, promoted to Air Group Commander in recognition of his tactical innovations, continued refining the doctrine through early 1943. He worked closely with engineering teams to develop better tactics for the new F-6F Hellcat fighter that would begin arriving soon, a more powerful aircraft designed specifically to fight the Zero on favorable terms. But the fundamental lesson remained constant. Success in air combat wasn't primarily about individual pilot skill or aircraft performance, though both mattered. Success came from disciplined application of sound tactics, from teamwork, from exploiting advantages and avoiding weaknesses. The 8-minute engagement on October 26th had proven these principles decisively, and every subsequent mission reinforced them. Martinez continued flying combat missions through the Guadalcanal campaign and beyond. He accumulated 11 confirmed kills by war's end, training new pilots in the tactics that had kept him alive. He never forgot that zero on Riley's tail, never forgot Chen diving out of the sun to save him, never forgot the importance of working together rather than trying to be a lone hero. Lieutenant Chen became a training officer in mid-1943, passing on her tactical knowledge to incoming pilots. Her analytical approach to combat had influenced squadron doctrine significantly, and her emphasis on patient, methodical tactics became a hallmark of American fighter training throughout the war. Ensign Riley survived his first combat tour and returned for a second, eventually achieving ace status with 7 confirmed kills. He never forgot his first engagement, never forgot freezing when that zero got on his tail, never forgot Martinez saving his life. Those memories kept him humble and focused on doing his job rather than seeking glory. The Enterprise herself continued fighting throughout the war, earning more battle stars than any other U.S. warship. Her air wings continued employing and refining the tactical doctrine developed in those desperate days of 1942, when every engagement was a learning experience and survival wasn't guaranteed. The tactical lessons learned that October morning, when 15 Zeros fell in 8 minutes of disciplined combat, shaped American naval aviation for the remainder of World War II and beyond. The principle of fighting to your strengths rather than the enemy's strengths became foundational doctrine, taught to generations of fighter pilots. In the weeks following that engagement, the Enterprise Air Wing conducted intensive training sessions. Caldwell insisted that every pilot, regardless of experience level, participate in tactical drills that reinforced the new doctrine. They practiced coordinated diving attacks over and over, working on communication, timing, and mutual support. The flight deck became a classroom where mistakes could be corrected before they became fatal. Martinez took a particular interest in mentoring younger pilots like Riley. He would sit with them in the ready room, sketching tactical diagrams on scratch pads, explaining the geometry of aerial combat in patient detail. He emphasized the importance of energy management, how altitude could be traded for speed, how speed could be converted back into altitude or maneuverability. These were fundamental concepts, but understanding them intellectually versus applying them under fire were entirely different challenges. Chen developed a comprehensive training curriculum that incorporated lessons from every engagement the squadron had fought. She collected gun camera footage, organized it by tactical scenario, and created a library that new pilots could study. Her methodical approach to teaching ensured that hard-won knowledge wasn't lost when veterans rotated home or were killed in action. The squadron was building institutional memory, creating a system that could survive the loss of individual pilots. Lieutenant Webb, working closely with the radar operators, refined intercept procedures to maximize the effectiveness of fighter direction. He developed standardized radio calls that conveyed critical information quickly and clearly. He created tactical plotting techniques that helped him visualize 3-dimensional battles and position fighters optimally. His innovations made the Combat Information Center a force multiplier, giving American fighters advantages that Japanese pilots couldn't counter. The maintenance crews deserved recognition too, Caldwell insisted. Their work keeping the Wildcats operational, often under difficult conditions, made everything else possible. Aviation mechanics worked around the clock, repairing battle damage, replacing worn parts, and ensuring every aircraft that launched was as reliable as human skill could make it. Their dedication was less visible than the pilots, but equally essential to the squadron's success. December brought more combat operations as American forces pressed their advantage in the Solomon Islands. The Japanese Navy fought back desperately, knowing that losing Guadalcanal would threaten their entire defensive perimeter in the South Pacific. Air battles occurred almost daily, and the Enterprise Air Wing was in the thick of it. On December 7th, exactly 1 year after Pearl Harbor, Martinez led a six-plane division on a fighter sweep over Japanese-held airfields in the northern Solomons. Intelligence indicated enemy aircraft were massing for a major attack, and the Americans wanted to disrupt those preparations. It was a risky mission, flying deep into enemy-controlled airspace, but the potential payoff justified the danger. The weather was typical for the tropics: towering cumulus clouds, occasional rain squalls, visibility that could change dramatically in minutes. Martinez used the clouds for concealment, threading his formation between the white towers while maintaining his navigation toward the target. His pilots flew with professional precision, maintaining formation without constant radio chatter that might give away their position. They found the Japanese airfield exactly where intelligence said it would be. 20 aircraft were visible on the ground, being fueled and armed. Martinez's tactical mind processed the situation instantly. Ground targets were vulnerable but dangerous. The parked aircraft would have minimal protection, but ground-based anti-aircraft guns would be a serious threat. He made his decision. All aircraft, this is lead. We're going in. Single pass, maximum damage, then we clear the area. Stay with your wingman. Go. The Wildcats rolled into steep dives, accelerating toward the airfield. Martinez selected a row of parked fighters, lined them up in his gun sight, and opened fire from 1,500 feet. His .50 caliber rounds tore into the aircraft, puncturing fuel tanks and starting fires. Explosions blossomed across the field as other members of his division attacked their assigned targets. Anti-aircraft fire erupted immediately, traces reaching up toward the American fighters. Martinez felt his Wildcat shudder as a shell burst nearby, shrapnel clattering against his fuselage. He pulled up hard, clearing the airfield at low altitude, staying just above the treetops to make himself a difficult target. Behind him, thick black smoke rose from burning aircraft. The division reformed quickly, checking in by radio. All 6 aircraft were airborne and functional, though several showed damage. Riley reported oil pressure fluctuations, but said he could make it back to the carrier. Martinez altered course for home, maintaining low altitude to stay under radar coverage as long as possible. The return flight was tense. Every pilot knew that Japanese fighters might be scrambled to intercept them, that they were deep in enemy territory with limited fuel and damaged aircraft. Martinez kept his eyes moving constantly, scanning for threats while monitoring his fuel gauge and his damaged wingman. They made it back to the Enterprise without further incident, though Riley's oil pressure had dropped to critical levels by the time he landed. The engine seized up as he cleared the arresting wire, a testament to how close the margin had been. Ground crew inspection revealed that his aircraft had taken 3 hits from anti-aircraft fire, including one that had punctured the oil cooler. Another few minutes, and the engine would have failed catastrophically. The strike was deemed successful. Intelligence estimated that 8 Japanese aircraft had been destroyed on the ground and several more damaged. More importantly, the raid had disrupted enemy preparations and demonstrated that American fighters could strike deep into Japanese-controlled territory with impunity. The psychological impact was significant, both for American morale and Japanese defensive planning. These operations continued through the winter months, grinding attritional warfare that slowly shifted the balance of air power in the South Pacific. The Enterprise Air Wing accumulated experience and refined their tactics with each engagement. Losses were inevitable, painful reminders that skill and doctrine couldn't guarantee survival, but the squadron maintained its effectiveness through careful training and leadership. Caldwell remained focused on tactical excellence rather than individual glory. He discouraged talk of ace status or personal victory counts, emphasizing instead team performance and mission accomplishment. This approach built a squadron culture that valued cooperation over competition, that celebrated wingmen who saved their partners even if they didn't get kills themselves, that understood air combat as a team sport rather than individual achievement. Years later, military historians would analyze that engagement as a turning point, the moment when American fighter tactics matured from desperate improvisation into systematic doctrine. The participants, scattered by time and distance, would remember it differently. Some remembered the fear, others the exhilaration, still others the sadness of friends lost. But they all remembered the fundamental lesson. In aerial combat, as in life, success comes not from individual heroics, but from discipline, teamwork, and the patient application of proven principles. The sky above the Pacific had been their classroom, and the tuition had been paid in blood and courage. What they learned there, they taught to others, creating a legacy that outlived them all. The Enterprise steamed on through Pacific waters, her crew constantly vigilant, her aircraft ready. Behind her stretched a wake that marked not just her passage through the ocean, but her journey through history, carrying men and women who learned to overcome fear, master their craft, and work together toward victory. The 8 minutes that changed everything were just one moment in a long war, but they were a moment that mattered, that made a difference, that showed what was possible when training, discipline, and courage came together at the critical time. The afternoon sun painted the flight deck gold as another combat air patrol launched into the tropical sky, pilots executing the carefully choreographed dance of carrier aviation. They climbed toward their assigned stations, eyes scanning the horizon, hands ready on their controls, minds focused on the mission. They were the inheritors of lessons learned in combat, the beneficiaries of tactical innovations purchased with sacrifice, the latest link in a chain of knowledge that stretched back through months of war. And somewhere among them, perhaps, were pilots who would face their own crucial moments, their own 8-minute engagements that would test everything they'd learned and everything they believed about themselves. They would find, as those who came before them found, that they were capable of more than they imagined, that discipline could overcome fear, that teamwork could achieve what individual skill could not. The Enterprise turned into the wind for recovery operations as evening approached, her island structure silhouetted against the setting sun. On the flight deck, landing signal officers prepared to guide returning aircraft home. In Combat Information Center, radar operators maintained their vigilant watch. In ready rooms throughout the ship, pilots prepared for the next mission, studying maps and weather reports and tactical updates. The war continued, as wars do, but the men and women of the Enterprise faced it with hard-won knowledge and unshakable commitment to the principles that had brought them through the fire. They had learned what mattered, what worked, what it took to survive and prevail. And they carried that knowledge forward into an uncertain future, confident not in their invincibility, but in their training, their teamwork, and their determination to do their duty whatever the cost. The Pacific stretched endless in every direction, holding secrets and dangers, challenges and opportunities. The Enterprise and her crew would meet them all, armed with courage, skill, and the lessons written in the sky above the Santa Cruz Islands on a brilliant October morning when everything changed in 8 unforgettable minutes.